So to ask questions, please submit them using the Q&A feature of WebEx. We'll respond to these written questions throughout the webinar. To submit questions, please be sure to use the Q&A feature and not the chat, which will be disabled. To find the Q&A feature, you can click on the three dots found at the bottom right-hand corner of WebEx. And when submitting questions, please include the name of your organization in parentheses. We ask that the webinar be used for asking clarifying questions. There will be an opportunity for stakeholders to submit informal comments after the webinar. And since we are regularly meeting with partnering California agencies to coordinate on this effort, we ask that staff from those partnering agencies hold their questions for those meetings and allow for broader stakeholder engagement on this webinar. Now I'd like to introduce all of our wonderful panelists. Next slide. So in developing this proposal, it's become clear that freight infrastructure planning is a big undertaking, and to do this right, it will require cross-sectoral coordination, including both the energy sector and transportation sector. CPUC staff have been working closely with numerous agencies in developing this proposal, and we have many of these partners joining us today as panelists. From the California Transportation Commission, we have Hannah Walter. From the California Energy Commission, we have Quentin G. and Mike Jaski. Annalisa Bevan is joining us from the Air Resources Board. And from the CAISO, or California Independent System Operator, we have Jeff Billington. Additionally, we have Ali Ashraghi from the CPUC's Integrated Resource Planning team. And from the Grid Planning and Reliability section, or DPP, we have Gabe Petlin, Rob Peterson, and Tyler Nam. We also have CPUC Energy Division Management joining us, including Simon Baker, the Energy Division Director of Distributed Energy Resources, Natural Gas and Retail Rates, Jen Calfoot, the Energy Efficiency and Transportation Electrification Branch Manager, and Matt Caldwell, the Distribution Planning Branch Manager. All of these panelists are happy to help answer questions that we received today. And last but not least, we have the Transportation Electrification team, which will be presenting today. Paula Grunling, the Transportation Electrification Section Supervisor, and her team, which includes Paul Douglas, Audrey Newman, Emily Clayton, myself, and Krista Heavey, a consultant from E3 who's supporting the work. Now I'll hand it over to Simon Baker for opening remarks. As I mentioned, Simon is the Energy Division Director of Distributed Energy Resources, Natural Gas, and Retail Rates.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you and provide some opening remarks about this important work being presented here today. The transportation electrification goals and regulations that California has adopted over the last several years represent substantial electrical load growth. We've begun to prepare for this through improvements to forecasting, shifting in our planning approach, and through staff-led efforts to advance our understanding of transmission electrification specific needs. In regard to forecasting, the California Energy Commission's 2021 IPER forecast, which is the starting point for all generation and infrastructure planning within the CAISO footprint, was the first to reflect high EV adoption levels consistent with CARB's Advanced Clean Cars 2 and the then proposed Advanced Clean Fleets regulations. The PUC and the CEC collaborated to develop this high electrification scenario forecast. And this was critical because the forecast and the IPER are used within the PUC grid planning processes, such as our integrated resource plan portfolios that we transmit to the CAISO's transmission planning process, and the IOU's annual distribution planning process. The forecast is also the basis for development and review of utility costs to be recovered in rates via the general rate case process. However, we know that there are particular challenges that need to be addressed in regard to new medium and heavy duty charging infrastructure, which can have very significant localized impact on electrical infrastructure. In April of this year, CARB adopted its Advanced Clean Fleet regulation that transitions drayage trucks, public and high priority fleets to zero emission through vehicle replacement requirements starting in 2024. And the success of this regulation depends on the availability of electrical grid infrastructure needed to accommodate vehicle charging needs. Historically, Planning for distribution and transmission infrastructure has been just in time, meaning that we plan for and authorize the utilities to invest in infrastructure when it's needed or when the need is certain. This, of course, does not provide enough flexibility given the uncertain lead times for large-scale fleet charging deployments. We recognize that. The proposed freight infrastructure planning framework aims to facilitate timely consideration of future electric infrastructure needed to support California's medium and heavy-duty freight electrification regulation, all while ensuring that medium and heavy-duty freight electrification doesn't compromise electric sector rates, affordability, reliability, and resiliency. Coordination between electric sector and transportation sector agencies will be critical to meeting ZEV targets and electric sector goals. That's why we've worked so closely with the California Transportation Commission in developing this proposal. However, we cannot accomplish these goals without the engagement and input of the industries and stakeholders that will be impacted by the changes. We're thrilled to see so many of you joining us in this webinar today. We're only just kicking off this effort, and although staff have put in a lot of work to develop a proposal, many unanswered questions remain. We hope that we can receive good input through your comments, and as this takes shape, we count on your participation. Thank you.
Thank you,
Carolina?
Simon. Thank you, and that's a perfect transition to the objectives of the webinar. Next slide. So staff is hosting this webinar with the objective to provide timely information to stakeholders about ongoing and planned activities. And we hope that stakeholders use this opportunity to ask clarifying questions and provide feedback. As Simon noted, this is early days in this effort, and we will rely heavily on the feedback provided by stakeholders, specifically in the comments, to really help shape FIP in the future. Participation in this webinar is open to the public, and the information discussed and the comments provided by stakeholders either during the webinar or later in writing are not part of any active proceeding. However, I do want to note that feedback received during and following the webinar may inform staff work products in the future, and may then flow into formal record of a proceeding. I also want to note that this webinar is intended to be a forum for technical discussion and not policy advocacy. With that said, the topics to be addressed in this webinar and future webinars on the FIP are likely to become highly technical. For this reason, we posted the presentation on the website 10 days ago, and we'll continue to do our best to provide materials and resources in advance of future webinars to give stakeholders ample time to become familiar with them. We ask the participants make a good faith effort to review and understand any materials provided in advance of the meetings. And additionally, we hope that participants work constructively and collaboratively to advance the objectives of this webinar. Next slide. So with that said, let's walk through the specific items that we have on the agenda today. Paula will kick things off with an overview of transportation electrification planning, including the long-term work, which includes FIP, but also near-term work that is very important, but out of scope for this specific webinar. Audrey will then provide background information, including the roles of the various agencies, the existing planning and forecasting processes, and the relevant CARB regulations, and will then build on this to explain why there is a need for more proactive planning. Paul will then cover the specific challenges under current forecasting and planning processes, and we'll then move to the proposal for the FIP framework. So the framework will have to be refined based on feedback we receive and would only be implemented in the future, maybe 2024. Paul will provide an overview, including the objectives of FIP, the proposed reforms, and the type of questions that FIP intends to answer. At that point, we will be about halfway through the webinar, and we'll take a 5-minute break. After we return from that break, Paul will walk through the FIP proposal and the specific steps that it involves. Following that, I'll go over the process reform that may be necessary to support MDHD electrification. I'll explain how we envision the FIP framework would fit into the existing forecasting, planning, and cost recovery processes. We'll plan to take another short break at that time, since I think everyone will need a break after looking at some very detailed diagrams. We'll then move into describing the ongoing FIP implementation assessment. And this is an indicative assessment only. We'll use the lessons learned from this proof of concept process to help shape our recommendations for the full framework. So under that section, I'll describe the case studies that we are currently conducting, and Krista will walk through the development of the TE inputs and assumptions used for that case study. Finally, we'll conclude by providing information on how stakeholders can engage in this work. Emily will provide an overview of the stakeholder schedule, and she'll walk through the instructions for submitting informal comments. And if time remains, we'll answer remaining questions verbally. Next slide. Here we have a slide that captures a good amount of the acronyms in our slides, probably not all of them, but we hope that this serves as a useful reference. All right. With that, maybe I'll just pause quickly for us to take a look at the Q&A feature. Again, just a reminder, if there are any questions, please use that Q&A feature to submit questions. Those are the three dots on the right-hand side, bottom of the screen. You can find the Q&A there. I don't see any questions at this time, so I think we can hand it over to Paula.
All right, thanks, Carolina. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Paula Grindling, Transportation Electrification Section Supervisor. I'll start the webinar today by doing a bit of a level set and clarifying the scope of the webinar. Next slide. Next slide. Right. So we see transportation electrification grid readiness work as involving challenges related to two broad sets of issues. Near-term known loads projects, infrastructure upgrades, which time, location, size are broadly known to the utilities, which are not in scope of the FIP. And then the medium to long-term infrastructure planning that involves a load that we anticipate showing up in the future, but size, time, location, and other characteristics are not really known to planners, which is in scope of today's webinar and of the FIP. Next slide. So first, a little bit more detail on what's not in scope of the FIP and today's webinar. The near-term known load projects challenges and delays, and which are related to compliance with the adopted EV service energization timeline for projects taking service under the EV infrastructure rules, Rules 29 and Rules 45. Upstream infrastructure upgrades related to necessary upgrades under Rule 15, substation upgrades, projects not covered by the average service energization, taking service under Rule 16, and projects above 2 megawatts. Other topics that are also investigated by staff, but outside of the FIP, are related to the load integration capacity analysis, or ICA maps, and DERs and vehicle-to-grid integration deferral opportunities. Staff is exploring these issues in coordination with the related processes, such as the general rate case, the high DER proceeding, implementation of Rules 15 and 16, flexible demand OIR, etc. So in short, these are issues that we are working on, but they are not in scope of the FIP and will not be discussed today. Next slide. So now looking at what's in scope. In scope of the FIP is medium and long-term planning, which involves generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure necessary in the over 3 to 20-year horizon that needs to be deployed while ensuring the state has safe, reliable, and cost-effective electricity supply. So the CPUC oversees the distribution and generation planning for the load-serving entities under its jurisdictions. And it's important to remind everyone that the public utilities are not under CPUC jurisdiction, just investor-owned utilities. These planning processes are based on load identified in the CEC's demand forecast. And the CPUC's responsibility is to determine if the generation and distribution needs identified by the jurisdictional load-serving entities' planning processes are reasonable to be recovered in rates. These planning processes are mostly based on modeling, of which methods, inputs, and assumptions are updated frequently. So this presentation will go over all these processes in more detail. Next slide. So having said all that, what is the Freight Infrastructure Planning Framework? The FIP, as we call it, and as described here, is a staff proposal to develop investment-grade inputs and assumptions to inform transportation and electrification infrastructure needs. In other words, inputs and assumptions that have been vetted and agreed upon to be of acceptable quality to inform investments that can be recovered in rates if formally adopted by the CPUC, ultimately resulting in billions of dollars of ratepayer investments. As we said before, the FIP time horizon covers medium and long term, which is over 3 years and up to 20, and does not focus on near-term readiness. So, and it's also focused only on the utility side infrastructure, not behind the meter infrastructure needs. At this stage, it is focused on medium and heavy duty infrastructure needs for freight because of its significant impact and limited available information. But with time and as we refine the framework, it may expand to light duty vehicle fast charging, fuel cells, and other use cases or vehicle types. And finally, we expect that this proactive planning approach to identify needs based on future loads may alleviate the deployment timing challenges that are experienced today. Next slide. So just to summarize, in scope of today's webinar is planning for long lead time infrastructure for anticipated future loads, and also alignment between the relevant planning processes, transportation electrification, distribution, transmission planning, and demand forecasting. Out of scope is short-term, known loads issues and energization challenges, also deferral options. Process alignment with existing transportation planning, although they're not in scope of the webinar, but we'll be discussing and addressing those as the process evolves with time. And also issues under the scope in the high DER proceeding. So this is what I have, and just pausing to have a look. There doesn't seem to be anything on the Q&A. So with that, I'll pass on to Audrey Newman to cover why proactive infrastructure planning is needed to support freight electrification. And thanks for everyone for participating.
All right, thank you, Paula. I'm toggling the slides and speaking, so bear with me. So now that we're clear on what the scope of today's discussion will be, I would like to jump into discussion of why this proactive infrastructure planning is necessary to support accelerated transportation electrification and medium and heavy duty fleet electrification in particular. So as most of you are aware, CARB has a variety of regulations aimed at decarbonization and air quality. While this slide does not touch on all of these regulations, these are the ZAV regulations that are most relevant to our conversation today. And included in this portfolio of CARB regulations are first the ACC2, or Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation, which is aimed at transforming the light duty vehicle population. The Innovative Clean Transit Regulation, which is aimed at decarbonizing public transit buses by 2040. The Advanced Clean Trucks Regulation, or ACT, which is aimed at increasing the percentage of zero-emission truck sales from manufacturers who certify Class 2B through Class 2A chassis or vehicles through 2036. And most recently, the ACF, or Advanced Clean Fleets Regulation, which will require a sweeping transition of drayage trucks, public fleets, and high priority fleets to be zero emissions starting in 2024. This massive transition will require significant grid upgrades and will involve grid integration challenges as a result of significant and concentrated new electrical load required to serve these vehicles and fleets. Given the significant and localized impacts to electric infrastructure resulting from medium and heavy-duty fleet electrification in particular, this infrastructure planning proposal in today's webinar will focus on the infrastructure needs and associated process improvements to serving medium and heavy-duty. As Paula mentioned, we do understand that this is not the only grid impact we must proactively plan for, but do believe this is a critical place to start. So as we begin to talk through what it means to plan for the current trajectory of accelerated TE or transportation electrification, we also must talk about the priorities we are balancing. So business priorities for fleets must be considered. This means we must ensure that to the best of our ability, our state policies and our grid planning do not unduly burden existing businesses nor compromise their ability to optimize their operations. This includes consideration of fleet routes and operational needs when we discuss grid planning. And then moving on to existing infrastructure and required time to upgrade, this references the fact that some upgrades will take time. For example, building a new substation cannot happen overnight. Building plans, permits, safety considerations, FERC approvals, etc., all take time. The same is true with building new transmission lines. Transmission upgrades will take 10 years to build. So we need to start this process before the load that triggers the upgrade shows up, and perhaps additionally consider how to prioritize various transmission upgrade projects. This long lead time is one of the key reasons that we are focusing today on long-term planning. Policy priorities like decarbonization, grid hardening, wildfire mitigation, and building electrification must also be considered. As we plan for and accelerate building infrastructure to support TE, we must be cognizant that the state, IOUs, and CPUC are balancing other policy objectives, which we cannot deprioritize. Lastly, here is cost and affordability. The speed and scale at which we build out the grid to support TE has a direct impact on ratepayer costs and affordability. One of our primary objectives at the CPUC is to ensure customer rates are just and reasonable. As such, we must ensure that affordability is factored into this conversation. All of these are critical interactive factors, and a balancing of these factors is one of the key challenges we face. To date, we have not had to consider this type of cross-sectoral optimization at this scale. One of the purposes of this framework is thus to elevate these trade-offs and demonstrate to our decision makers which trade-offs we need to assess and discuss. The framework we are presenting today itself will not make these decisions on trade-offs. However, it is important to keep this balancing act in mind. Beyond balancing of priorities, we also have numerous agencies with differing authorities and responsibilities that all will be involved to some extent with proactive electric sector planning. Given the interconnection of our planning processes with other agencies' forecasting and planning processes, the timely deployment of the infrastructure required to support medium and heavy-duty electrification can only happen via close coordination between these relevant agencies overseeing energy, transportation, and air quality. Each of these agencies has an important role to play in this transition. Specifically, it is important to highlight here that the planning process does not begin with the CPUC nor with the IOUs, but rather with CEC forecasting. But even before that, our ZEV policies and thus planning for them really begin with CARB. CARB, or the Air Resources Board, sets the emission targets for each sector, transportation, electric, etc., and adopts ZEV regulations, ZEV vehicle regulations, I should say, and oversees the low carbon fuel standard transportation fuel regulation aimed at decreasing the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. This objective outlines our state's objectives and what we are planning towards. So while the ZEV vehicle regulations begin with CARB, our planning process really begins in earnest with CEC. CEC develops and adopts the annual CED forecast as part of the IPER forecast, which incorporates demand from existing or reasonably expected CARB regulations where possible. Additionally, the CEC assesses biennially the EV charger needs or behind the meter needs to support the state's ZEV adoption goals via the AB 2127 directed EV charging infrastructure assessment. The IPER, not the 2127 assessment, but the IPER is the starting point in determining the demand for electricity that will result from the CARB regulations. At the CPUC, we oversee and authorize investments in generation and distribution infrastructure. We inform transmission planning investments and ensure a reliable and affordable electric system for our ratepayers. It is important to emphasize here that our various CPUC and IOU planning processes depend on the CEC forecast as an input. As we will discuss a bit more on the next slide, CAISO's role involves authorizing transmission investments based on generation portfolios prepared and adopted by the CPUC and a demand forecast adopted by the CEC. Outside of the energy realm, CTC, or the California Transportation Commission, is responsible for programming and allocating funds for the construction of highways, passenger rail, transit, and active transportation improvements throughout California. The CTC works with Caltrans on transportation infrastructure planning and implementation. So as you can see, the coordination alone is a very critical component to our success. It is also critical to understand what our planning process currently looks like, how each piece feeds into another, in order to understand where tweaks, adjustments, new or updated information should be inserted to meet new and accelerated targets for transportation electrification. I realize this is a very busy slide, so perhaps helpful to look at this after we share these slides around, but starting from the top, as mentioned in the previous slides, CARB adopts ZEV regulations, which CEC includes within its IPER CED forecast. As we move through this chart, we then get to the green forecasting section. As already mentioned, essentially where our electric sector planning process begins is with forecasting, and there are two key forecasts that inform these processes: CEC's IPER and CARB's scoping plan. The CEC IPER forecast is the starting point for all distribution, transmission, and generation planning. CEC IPER CED forecast is the demand forecast used for infrastructure and reliability planning, and which is updated annually. CARB's scoping plan and state implementation plan are economy-wide planning efforts to reach our state greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets and plan for achieving air quality standards. These plans are updated every 5 years. Moving down to the pink planning section, each of these forecasts feeds into infrastructure planning processes. The IPER CED forecast informs all of these planning processes: CPUC's distribution planning process, or DPP, CPUC's integrated resource planning, or IRP, and CAISO's transmission planning process, or TPP. Starting with the CPUC's distribution planning process, DPP, the IOUs use the statewide IPER to forecast distribution overloads and deficiencies. As the IPER provides a system-wide forecast, the IOUs then must disaggregate this down to a more localized level. IOUs then plan projects to upgrade the distribution system out to 5 years, although the earlier years tend to be more reliable as situations can evolve in those later years. When feasible, CPUC's DPP leverages DERs, or distributed energy resources, to use to defer traditional upgrades out to 10 years. However, this is not a replacement for all needed investments. The IPER CED forecast also informs CAISO's transmission planning process, or TPP, which is the process, this process assesses transmission needs, approves transmission projects, and is updated annually. By contrast to the other two planning processes, both the IPER and CARB's scoping plan inform CPUC's IRP. The IRP establishes greenhouse gas targets within CARB's adopted greenhouse gas range for CPUC jurisdictional load-serving entities. IRP then models and develops portfolios of electricity resources to meet the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals while maintaining reliability at the lowest possible cost. The results of the IRP are that it orders procurement and then oversees compliance of that procurement. Then, as noted with the arrows between IRP and TPP, the CPUC's IRP transmits generation portfolios to CAISO for use in its TPP, And additionally, TPP provides transmission upgrade estimates back to IRP, as noted with this bidirectional arrow. Lastly, LSCs or load-serving entities planning and procurement processes are noted here. These plans are filed per SB 350 and other CPUC guidance, and procurement then occurs in compliance with CPUC directives. There are a couple other reddish or orangish arrows here on the diagram. The arrows between IRP and LSC's planning and procurement indicate that IRP provides guidance to load-serving entities, and LSCs develop plans that inform the preferred system plan, hence the bidirectional arrow. IRP also directs procurement via procurement orders. The arrows between LSC's planning and procurement and TPP indicate that LSCs are supposed to take under consideration existing available transmission capacity and potential upgrades that would be necessary when developing IRP plans. Procurement orders, if location specific, are considered in busbar mapping or IRP resource portfolios and reflected in what we pass to CAISO for transmission planning. So moving on, what I want to highlight here with this slide is that we have already started high electrification planning for the electric sector with some adjustments already underway. As mentioned already, all of this planning begins with CEC's IPER forecast. The CPUC's generation and distribution planning, as well as CAISO's TPP, begins with CEC's adopted IPER mid-case energy demand forecast. Traditionally, it should also be noted that these forecasts typically reflect only adopted regulations from CARB, as the CEC aims to detail what it actually expects in terms of demand. However, given the potential impact of the ACF on the electric system, this approach needed some adjustment in order to help plan for ACF prior to its adoption. In anticipation of the ACF adoption, CEC worked with CPUC, CAISO, and CARB to develop a policy-based forecast that included assumptions based on the draft ACF regs. The reason for this was to begin consideration of the grid planning needs to support this ambitious regulation. To do this, the high TE forecast, or high transportation electrification forecast, was adopted in May 2022 as an addition to the CE's 2021 IPER. This more aggressive forecast is already being used by the three large IOUs in their distribution planning in respective 2023 GNA and DDORs, which are due Q3 of 2023, and by IRP in its development of a high electrification generation portfolio. As mentioned on the previous slide, the CPUC's IPER informs CAISO's TPP process, and this is the generation portfolio used as a policy-driven sensitivity in the CAISO's 2022 to 2023 TPP. These results are expected to be finalized this month. Beginning with the 2022 IPER, CEC's planning forecast expanded to formally include impacts from the draft ACF. Thus, this was the first IPER to integrate these planning assumptions fully. While all of this work highlighted here has begun, it's important to keep in mind that additional work is still needed. First, a lot of forecasts are statewide, and thus there is a lot of remaining work to ensure the level of granularity and locality needed to inform and modify some of these processes. Additionally, while we have been working within existing planning processes to begin planning for high electrification and TE, accelerated TE also requires modifications to our existing planning processes. We are going to dive deeper into that further into this presentation, though. Beyond the grid planning processes I just described, Caltrans and CTC also have planning processes to assess transportation needs specifically. While these are outside of the energy planning processes, we are striving to leverage this work as we move forward with the FIP. To note a few of the planning endeavors that these agencies are working through, Caltrans develops the Interregional Transportation Strategic Plan, which provides direction to programs, districts, and partner agencies and the policies and strategies to consider when assessing the interregional transportation system and identifying improvements. The California Freight Mobility Plan is California's state freight plan, also developed by Caltrans. It identifies freight corridors, includes an infrastructure funding plan and investment priorities, and discusses the condition of freight infrastructure in the state. From CTC, the SB 671 Clean Freight Corridor Efficiency Assessment is an initial zero-emission freight infrastructure assessment that identifies freight corridors or segments of corridors and infrastructure needed to support the deployment of zero-emission medium and heavy-duty vehicles. The CTC is going to use this assessment to identify challenges related to timing, cost, and economic impacts to the legislature. The bill, SB 671, also requires that CEC and CARB incorporate, where feasible, the assessment's findings and recommendations into their relevant programs and guidelines. It is important to note that this SB 671 assessment will not directly result in electric grid infrastructure authorizations or cost recovery, as that's something that is within the CPUC's jurisdiction. However, we are planning to continue to collaborate with the CTC as well as other transportation agencies like Caltrans going forward. And I'm going to kick it over to Paul to take over presenting.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Audrey. Again, I'm Paul Douglas, and I'll be discussing some of the planning and forecasting challenges associated with accelerated electrical infrastructure deployment. Next slide, please. So the first challenge is just-in-time planning and cost recovery, which Simon briefly mentioned in his opening comments. This is regulatory parlance for waiting till there's some certainty regarding the infrastructure need before making a formal determination of that need and approving cost recovery. While this has been historically a very prudent and appropriate approach from a ratepayer perspective, as Simon noted, this approach doesn't provide sufficient flexibility to consider long lead time assets and authorizing the infrastructure sufficiently in advance of the need. Regarding the time needed for state planning, one planning cycle for TE infrastructure is approximately 3 years long, and that's because each planning cycle starts with the CEC adopting an IPA forecast in year 1. Then in year 2, DPP and IRP use that IPA forecast to assess the infrastructure and generation needs. And then in year 3, the ISO studies the transmission implications using the generation portfolio that IRP developed in year 2. And so the takeaway here is that we need to always be thinking about 2 or 3 years out into the future when developing our study plan every year, if we want to avoid missing a planning opportunity today. Another barrier to proactive planning is that the state doesn't have a common set of TE inputs that all agencies can use for planning and forecasting. And what this means is that the agencies could potentially be planning for different futures. Another challenge is that there is significant uncertainty about the TE market and the technology used to enable electrification. For example, what is the percentage of renewable hydrogen production that's going to be dependent on power from the grid versus on-site generation? And another uncertainty is the impact of supply chain constraints, such as the transformers on your power poles outside your house and lithium batteries for your vehicle. So while there's a lot, while there's a lot of current discussions about the role of renewable hydrogen and what will in the decarbonization of the transportation sector, the actual planning for hydrogen-related electrical infrastructure hasn't started. Next slide, please. Historically, load forecasters only consider the impact of load modifiers like energy efficiency, which reduces the need for generation electrical infrastructure. However, TE has turned this paradigm on its head because, unlike energy efficiency, TE will result in more generation infrastructure being built. And I'm highlighting this because generation infrastructure deployment has a different risk profile than what load forecasters have historically been modeling. For example, one risk that load forecasters don't consider is the impact of delayed distribution and transmission infrastructure on the TE adoption forecast. Another is the misalignment of eventual MDHD charging behavior versus what we actually plan for. And this is significant because if we assume the fleet charging behavior is flexible and in reality it's not, then we might end up building infrastructure that doesn't adequately support fleet charging needs. Another barrier to proactive planning is the lack of a granular MDHD load forecast. As Audrey noted earlier, the IOUs use the CEC system level IPA forecast for distribution planning, and that is a forecast at the transmission level. However, a system level forecast doesn't appropriately capture the local MDHD loads associated with freight corridors and distribution warehouses. Next slide, please. All right. One of the first things we were told when we reached out to the other agencies about MDHD infrastructure planning was that the grid planning cannot result in fleets having to materially deviate from their most economic route when charging. However, there is no existing infrastructure that, there's no existing information that planners can use to quantify the fleet's en-route charging needs. And I should note here that the CTC's draft SB 671 assessment, which we've Audrey briefly mentioned, has provided some high-level information about the potential number and location of these chargers, but planners need more granular information about specific charging locations along freight corridors. Another challenge is that there is no planning framework that can optimize fleet charging needs and also the electric sector's planning requirements. Ideally, we would have a framework that could evaluate the cost and timing of electrifying various corridor segments while also ensuring that the upgrades are cost effective. And this is something that Simon touched upon briefly in his opening comments also. And then lastly, there's no process for identifying long-term substation land acquisition needs. And this is needed because TE growth will likely occur in areas where it is impossible to expand the physical parameter of a substation because vacant land is scarce and expensive. Next, please. So Audrey, I think if you, so now what I'm going to now do is walk through the staff's FIP proposals. Audrey, if you could click through to slide 27. Great, thanks. So FIP has two overarching objectives. The first is to ensure that the MDHD freight electrification doesn't compromise rates, reliability, and resiliency. And that's sort of a reoccurring theme that you've heard today. And the second is to facilitate the achievement of ARB's recently adopted Advanced Clean Fleet regs and potentially other regulations. And we would achieve this by, through this proposal, ensuring that the use of common inputs and assumptions are used across existing long-term planning and forecasting processes. We identify intra and interagency process reforms needed to enable proactive planning. We establish a process for TE planning to inform charging infrastructure funding and inform future TE policy development. And as it's been noted a couple of times already, while FIP is initially focusing on MDHD freight electrification, the scope of FIP could be expanded to other TE market segments that are dependent on long lead time infrastructure, such as light duty vehicle charging plazas. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to walk through the 5 proposed reforms identified in the staff proposal. And the first one is to establish a process for developing common inputs and assumptions that would be used in distribution planning, resource planning, forecasting, and cost recovery. And that's what's going to really enable that is the establishment of a fleet-centric stakeholder process that we would use to vet forecasting and planning inputs and charger scenarios. The second reform would be implementing a MDHD forecasting process that better considers infrastructure risk and timing by studying a wider range of scenarios. And I've touched upon this briefly already, but some of the risks that could be studied in a scenario could be uncertainty around long-term electric rates and how they impact electric vehicle adoption, could be delayed construction of distribution and transmission infrastructure, and also sort of different scenarios around charging behavior out in 2030, 2035 timeframe. Next slide, please. So the third reform would be developing a framework that can optimize fleet and electric sector needs while meeting policy goals. So policy goals that we can consider would be air quality, DAX, cost minimization, and also fleet mobility needs, which we've already talked about briefly, but are the sort of the current and future truck routes that potentially are inflexible from a charging perspective. Apologize, there's a little construction going next door and it's loud here. Another element that we'd want to consider in this sort of optimization would be identifying these charging zones, and that could be anything from ready to electrify zones that don't require major investments, optimal zones that meet both the electric sector and fleet needs, zones of highest priority for infrastructure development, because we know today that it's going to take a long time to energize, and any other type of zone that would prove useful to a planning agencies and the market. The fourth reform would be the option for interagency process for coordinated charging infrastructure funding that is informed by planning, which is currently not the case right now. I mean, I'll just leave it at that. Reform 5 would be establishing an interagency feedback loop between the electric infrastructure planning and ARB to inform assessment of ACF and other ZEV regulations and their implementation. Next slide, please. So this is a process diagram that just shows at a very high level sort of the flow of FIP design and implementation. So it starts with a basically on the left with an implementation assessment, which will be used to beta test aspects of the proposal. The assessment has already started and will be completed late this summer, and Carolina will be going into the assessment in more detail later on in this presentation. Moving to the right, based on lessons learned during the assessment and stakeholder feedback on this proposal, the Commission and its sister agencies will begin formally integrating the FIP into planning and forecasting late this year, early 2024. And then lastly, on the right, the diagram shows that FIP would be a reoccurring process once it's implemented. Specifically, the inputs and assumptions would be updated annually, and the optimal charging locations would be updated on a biennial basis. And during that entire time, we'll be monitoring the deployment of charging and grid infrastructure relative to ARB ZEV regulations and timelines. Next slide, please. So here are some questions that would be addressed during the implementation assessment and also when FIP is implemented when FIP is implemented. And one of the things I need to highlight here is that due to the limited time we have for conducting the assessment, we'll be addressing these questions in a more narrow and at a higher level during the assessment. So some of the questions could be, the amount of additional freight infrastructure, whether it's hydrogen or electrical stations needed to support ACF rules. What should be the charging infrastructure? Where should the charging infrastructure be located? And how much time will it take to build this infrastructure? What's the time? How does the time frame align with ARB's deadlines? And if not, what steps can be taken? What is the cost of the transition to zero emission freight for both the ratepayer and the freight industry? And what is the impact of MDHD electrification on grid reliability, especially local reliability? So we have like the LA Basin and Edison's territory and the Bay Area and PG&E's territory. These are resource constrained load pockets. And so the significant amount of electrification is going to occur there, while at the same time, we're also doing building electrification. These are things that we need to think about. Are we doing a break here, or are we going to move on to the next slide?
No, we're going to do a break after your next section.
Got it. All right. So now I'm going to describe the elements of the proposed FIP framework. So a few things to keep in mind when you look at this process diagram is one, as you can see by the boxes and the arrows, that it's a recurring flow for the work, and it's starting with step 1 in the bottom left-hand corner of the diagram. 2, each box performs a specific function, which is described in the title of the box. 3, in the title of each box is a list of agencies that are involved in the function, and the first agency in the list is the lead agency. And then lastly, in the top right-hand corner of the diagram is a box that identifies the frequency a particular function is performed. So for instance, it says box number 1, developing inputs and assumptions. Staff recommendation is that it's done on an annual basis. So having said that, let's get into the specifics of the proposal. So starting in the bottom left-hand corner, step 1, we're developing common freight inputs. So CPUC would be the lead with assistance from CTC, CEC, and ARB. So we would start with convening a freight-centric stakeholder process. It's a modeling advisory group, something similar to what we have in IRB, which is focusing on the technical aspects of electrification, not the policy aspects. So we would develop a common set of inputs and assumptions for planning and forecasting, which would be vetted by this MAG. And then we would also, in this first step, update sort of a deployment schedule for chargers based on the ACF regs and actual construction timelines. So then we'd move, with that information, then we'd move to step 2, and we would develop scenarios of freight charging zones. And so I just want to emphasize here, charging zones versus charging locations. So this is state level planning, potentially down to the distribution level, to be very specific about infrastructure needs at a very granular level far out into the future is probably not realistic. And so what we're focusing on here is regions of charging versus a specific charging site. There could be a situation where we'd have a very large DC fast charging station. And so maybe that is appropriate to study specifically. But here what we're focusing on is more as zones of charging that would impact the electrical infrastructure. So having said that, we would determine initial charging locations based on the truck volume and truck routes by vehicle class. And that would be like in-route charging, depot charging, short and long haul routes, and routes that cross domestic and international borders. And then we develop charging zones, scenarios that capture key risks and uncertainties. And I just want to highlight at this stage, we're not looking at the electrical infrastructure timing and cost. This is just the initial scenario development. And there was questions in the Q&A about when are you going to look at ports and other segments of transportation that need electrification. And as we noted earlier, we're going to start with freight to get this framework up and running. And then once we see that it works, then we'll start bringing in these other market segments that have long lead time infrastructure needs. So this is just the starting point. So please don't be worried if you don't see your market segment here. We'll get there eventually. Step 3 is where we rank the MDHD charging zones based on electrical infrastructure impacts. So that would be the IOUs using their existing distribution planning process, and also working with the ISO to understand the transmission implications. IOUs would determine the distribution and transmission costs for step 2 scenarios. And then working with the IOUs and the ISO, the PUC would rank, just coming up with a ranking system potentially like red, yellow, green, charging zones based on cost and timing of associated electrical infrastructure relative to the charger deployment schedule developed in step 1. So that's where we actually start seeing where the gap is between when the chargers need to be there to be consistent with the ACF regs versus the timing it would take to plan, build, and energize the infrastructure. So then we move to step 4, and we develop a reference case for least regrets MDHD charger locations. And I use the phrase least regrets here because, when you're doing long-term planning, there's absolutely no certainties. So what you're trying to do is look at a variety of futures and say across multiple futures, what is least regret? And that's the best you can really do with long-term planning, particularly for a nascent market like electrification, transportation electrification. So what we would do is taking the rankings that we got in step 3, carry it over to step 4, and we would work with the freight MAG, and we'd consult with them and say, what are the market, regulatory, and operational implications of the scenarios and sensitivities? And we would iterate. So you can see there's arrows go back and forth between step 3 and step 4. So first, utilities do the initial ranking, or we would do with utilities in the ISO the initial ranking. Consult with the industry. Industry says, no, you don't have that much flexibility to move this charger, even if it's red. So then we would work with you and our other agents to figure out where are all their alternatives. So then we would iterate back and forth until we find what we deem sort of a least regret solution. And that's defined as having a minimal impact on freight, but also reflecting sort of a realistic timing for a new electrical infrastructure, and it doesn't compromise rates, reliability, or resiliency. And then, this was touched upon by Audrey briefly, which is that, the purpose of this framework is to elevate for the first time in a transparent, structured, organized manner, what would it take to get there? And if we identify a variety of charging zones that potentially there's a timing gap between when the infrastructure is ready and when the chargers need to be there, then we would use this framework to elevate to the energy principles and the transportation principles some of these issues and discuss with them the trade-offs. And so we would be recommending a development of some type of interagency working group, like a high electrification working group, consistent with another working group we have called the JASC. If you're not familiar with it, it's in the energy sector. We use it for identifying and developing demand side scenarios and inputs. Then we would adopt step 4 base case and sensitivities probably every 2 years in a TE proceeding. And then we would adopt the inputs that we developed in this process, step 1, on an annual basis. So then you move over to step 5, and you can see where the inputs scenarios could inform various proceedings and activities at other agencies. So distribution planning, resource planning, transmission planning, TE, that could be, directing funding for behind the meter charging infrastructure, and IPER forecast. Then moving over to the right, this could also inform the CEC's AB 2127 report around assessment of the number of chargers needed for electrification, and the CTC's clean freight corridor assessment. Step 6 is where we have a feedback loop between this sort of grid readiness assessment and ARB ZEV regulations. And this is where we would discuss, what the implications are for implementation and compliance and enforcement associated with regs and that are dependent on this infrastructure, and what changes need to occur, if any at all. And then step 7, touched upon this briefly, we'd use this grid readiness assessment to inform where to direct charging funding. So the CPUC would be the lead with CEC and CTC assistance. And potentially this could also be used to inform other funding efforts, such as the NEVI sort of funding process at the CEC. That's just using that as an example, and that's just a potential option. So I'll stop right there. And Carolina, are we at break time?
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. Good timing. We will move to a break in just a bit, but first I just wanted to see if there are any questions that we have not yet addressed. I believe there is one question that we could potentially address verbally. Paul and Paula, maybe you can answer this. I'll read it out loud. This is Arvind Kalis, sorry if I mispronounced that, from Volvo Group North America. ECT that was passed a couple years ago and is intended to set the tone for ZEV truck sales in the state. Without charging infrastructure, customers are having a hard time taking on deliveries of the ZEV trucks. How does FIP intend to address this issue so that we can successfully meet the state goals and regulations?
Paul, you want that, or would you like
Yeah,
to take that?
I can start. So
Okay.
as I explained in the opening, issues that are related with loads that are, looking at an energization process now, or are known loads that have initiated discussion with utilities or are known to the utilities, are out of scope of the FIP in terms of the time horizon. The FIP is a long-term framework that we hope with the implementation and with this long-term view on planning, we'll start getting ahead of the needed upgrades for the infrastructure, so that whenever the developers and the customers are ready to start building the charging infrastructure, most of the upgrades will have gotten ahead of the timeline that it takes for those upgrades to be available. The issues or any challenges related to the known projects as I said, we are investigating. We are just not dealing with in this particular webinar. And Paul, I don't know if you want to add anything to it.
No, that was great. I think just emphasizing that this is long lead time infrastructure, so that would be distribution, substation, and higher. And so hopefully at some point when we are identifying all these needs and the impact at the sort of substation and higher levels, that we get ahead of sort of the problems that you're dealing with in the near term. So that's all I have to say.
All right, great. And then I see a couple of questions have been submitted, but I believe we'll respond to those via the Q&A feature. All right, so with that, we can take a 5-minute break. We'll be back at 3:09. All right, everyone, it is 3:09, so we will get back to the webinar. We have received a few follow-ups in the Q&A feature regarding questions submitted earlier by Howard. Audrey, do you want to go ahead and respond to that?
Happy to, Carolina. So just in response to the question from Howard on, the Port of Long Beach and making sure that there are these other frontline agencies that have a voice and a seat at the table, I think one thing we wanted to note, and I wrote this in the chat, is, today is really step one for the FIP presentation and the FIP framework. I realize, we've been working internally on this proposal to bring forward to you all, but this is certainly not a final proposal. This is step one, by which we will be seeking additional feedback, both through the comments that will be described at the end of this webinar and through other informal engagement. I think it's also important to note that this is not yet within a formal proceeding. This is a webinar, and we are seeking this feedback currently. So there will be additional opportunities to get those comments heard, to hear from those frontline agencies. And I do want to make sure that we're not leaving the impression that this is some sort of final proposal that is going forward exactly as is. We know that this will be shaped by those conversations as we move forward.
Thank you, Audrey. Yeah, maybe I will just highlight there one of the key steps and reasons we are holding this now is to help us refine the scope for the final framework proposal, and some of the items that I'll be discussing speak to that. And so, we really do hope that the feedback we receive will help define that scope, including, what vehicle types should be included, and what agencies we should be collaborating with, what process gaps we're not capturing. So yeah, early days, and we are sharing this, when it is still very much so just kind of preliminary ideas, and mostly focusing on the issues that we have identified, and some preliminary solutions, so that we can receive as much feedback as possible at this stage. All right, so with that, now that Paul has described the FIP framework, my goal in this next section will be to ensure that everyone walks away with an understanding of how the framework could potentially inform forecasting, planning, and funding. And I want to note at the top that staff have a lot of open questions in regards to process alignment. And so, as I just said, we really do encourage stakeholders to take some time to process these diagrams and submit comments on opportunities for alignment, specifics for those that we have already kind of captured here, but also others that we may have overlooked. And a lot of this is very electric sector centric at this point in time, because that is what we know. But we are hoping, under the framework, to really make sure we are incorporating the transportation sector alignment pieces as well. And that's something we have been discussing with the California Transportation Commission, is the need to do that. But that is a portion that we still need to better understand. So I'll begin with describing the status quo. So you can move to the next slide. So this means, what are the existing process and interdependencies that are relevant to FIP? So on this diagram, you can see 3 broad categories of processes: forecasting, which is in yellow. This includes the IPER, and then planning in green. This includes DPP and TPP and IRP, and then cost recovery in red, which includes GRC and TAC. I want to note that this is not a comprehensive diagram of all the processes. These are processes that we see as most relevant to FIP, and that we, are familiar enough to provide an overview of at this stage. However, if you believe we're missing something important here, we hope that you will submit comments on that. I also want to note that these are recurring processes that happen on a regular basis. Many of them are annual or biannual, and this is not reflected in this diagram because it would add a level of complexity that would distract from the objective of this diagram. But the timing of these processes is one of the multiple important factors that really needs to be considered in process alignment. All right, so now that we have the basics of the diagram down, let's walk through it. First, in the small orange box, we have the CEC's IPER. This is the Integrated Energy Policy Report that's part of what CEC develops. The energy demand forecast is the most important portion for this process. And recently, the time horizon for that forecast has been extended from 10 years to 15 years. And this forecast now includes the additional achievable transportation electrification scenario that Audrey mentioned, or the AATE, which accounts for recent policy shifts such as advanced clean cars too. In addition to the forecast, the CEC develops a second work product in which they allocate the load to specific substations. So let's start with the top path first. If we move to number 2, we see that the CEC's IPER demand forecast is used in distribution planning process, or DPP, and this includes a local reliability scenario which utilities aim to match. Moving to box 3, the IOUs use local variables to build up to the IPER forecast, and at times they do exceed the IPER. And they identify distribution system overloads, upgrades, and opportunities for DERs. Moving to number 4, the IOUs then submit an application as part of the general rate case process, and the costs of the distribution system upgrades are then recovered through ratepayers, as reflected under number 5. So that is how the IPER informs DPP, which flows into the GRC. The IPER forecast also flows into 2 other planning processes, the TPP and the IRP. So we'll cover those 2 paths now. Looking at box 6, for the TPP, or the transmission planning process, the CEC provides the most recent IPER load forecast allocated down to transmission substations. This geographic granularity is necessary for CAISO to assess system needs, transmission system needs. The CEC's demand forecast also informs the integrated resource planning process. As described in boxes 7 and 8, IRP uses the forecast as one of many inputs into capacity expansion model, which solves for the question of what portfolios of electricity resources are necessary to meet the load, while also meeting the policy goals at least cost, while also ensuring a reliable system. So a lot to solve for there. And IRP then provides guidance to load-serving entities on the resources that they need to plan for and procure. And that's depicted in box 8. So the resource portfolio produced by IRP not only informs load-serving entities, but importantly for FIP, it serves as a key input to transmission planning, because the CAISO needs information at a specific geographic granularity for their assessments. What resources do we expect will come online? And then they're able to plan transmission for that. So the CPUC maps the generation and storage resources to specific bus bars at substations so that the CAISO can take that under consideration alongside the load, which we saw under number 6 was also allocated to substations. Moving to box 10, the CAISO's TPP then uses this information from the CEC and CPUC's IRP processes to identify transmission needs 10 years out, and the CAISO Board of Governors approves the transmission plan. The transmission need then moves to a competitive solicitation process to identify the lowest cost transmission provider, and as seen in box 11, the transmission project costs are recovered through transmission access charge, or TAC. Next slide. So now that we have these basics down, we can move to how FIP would layer on top of the existing processes. This diagram, like the last, has the same 3 categories: forecasting, planning, and cost recovery. However, it includes a few differences. First, you will see the navy box on the left This box represents freight infrastructure planning and the reforms that Paul walked through. Another element of this diagram is that what is contained in the description of the blue boxes is what information would flow from one process to the other. And this includes two elements flowing from existing processes into FIP, as depicted in box 1 and 2. That's the darker blue. And then the remainder of the boxes are showing how FIP outputs would be used as inputs into existing processes. So under this proposal, distribution planning would provide a 15-year out distribution upgrade estimates to FIP, as indicated by box 1. This would be a reform to an existing process and would include a menu of distribution upgrade options, their costs and timing to get them online. Similarly, as depicted by 2 near the bottom, CAISO would provide transmission upgrade estimates to FIP, and this could simply be done through the white paper estimates that CAISO already provides to IRP. Moving to box 3, which is freight infrastructure planning, FIP would develop common T inputs and assumptions to be used across all forecasting and planning processes, as Paul described. So specifically, the INA, along with inputs provided under number 1 and 2, would be used to co-optimize distribution and transmission needs and identify optimal zones for EV charging infrastructure, FIP zones. And this would be a new process. More work needs to be done to develop a detailed proposal for how to co-optimize for distribution and transmission system needs. We know that there is some consideration of distribution when planning for transmission, especially by the IOUs and CAISO, but from initial conversations, our understanding is that stronger linkage is needed, especially when it comes to the agency planning side. And as Paul explained earlier, one key reform that we propose as part of the FIP framework is to identify optimal charging zones. And this co-optimization matters because it would play an important role in identifying those optimal charging zones. We need to optimize for fleet needs, such as existing truck routes that may be inflexible, but also for policy goals, such as meeting ZEV regs, while also minimizing electric ratepayer costs. And the way we minimize those ratepayer costs is through co-optimization of distribution and transmission needs. Next, we can look at box 4. The common T inputs and assumptions and the FIP optimal zones would be used in DPP to improve the identification of distribution infrastructure needs in a timely manner. And due to the long lead time of many of the grid upgrades, a 15-year time horizon could be used to identify those distribution upgrades. Then if we move to box 5, the downstream implications of using the FIP outputs for distribution planning would be that cost recovery requests made by IOUs after using the FIP optimal charging zones and the common T inputs and assumptions would help support the justification for cost recovery for distribution upgrades under the GRC. Moving to box 6, FIP would also inform CEC's IPER. The common T inputs and assumptions would be incorporated into the assumptions used for developing the IPER forecast. And the FIP optimal charging zones could also potentially inform IPER. And finally, the load bus allocation produced by CEC could be informed by the bottoms up FIP MDHD load assessment. So these improvements to forecasting and the allocation of the forecast to load buses would in turn inform all the planning processes and improve the accuracy with which infrastructure needs are identified. So you could see this reflected by the arrows flowing from the IPER to DPP, TPP, and IRP. Next, we can move to box 7, where FIP outputs would inform IRP. So similarly, IRP could use common T inputs and assumptions, and this would improve the accuracy of the quantity of generation and transmission need identified by IRP, as I described on the previous slide. Additionally, IRP, as I mentioned, provides inputs to TPP, And so the FIP optimal zones can inform IRP mapping of the generation and the storage in those portfolios to specific bus bars at substations, which are used by CAISO to identify the transmission needs. Therefore, FIP outputs would support cost recovery justification under TAC, box 8. And then finally, box 9 shows that FIP outputs could be used to inform funding of charger locations to ensure deployment occurs in identified locations. So the key takeaways of this slide, I would say there are a couple of existing processes that could provide inputs into FIP. And then FIP outputs could serve as valuable inputs into the existing processes. And this includes the IPER, which serves as a starting point for the majority of the planning processes in the electric sector. These reforms, we believe, would improve grid preparedness for freight electrification and ensure that ratepayer funds are used more efficiently and effectively. All right, next slide. Great. So actually, let's, before we move here, let me just take a pause and see, are there any questions that we need to address verbally for those panelists that have been following the Q&A?
I think that we can clarify medium and heavy duty and freight. Richard from Call Advocates is asking if they are being used interchangeably. And it's not necessarily interchangeably. Maybe you caught a little bit of a terminology issue there on the deck, but the FIP is at the moment mostly focused on freight, which it is a subset of medium and heavy duty use cases. So with time, we might expand to other use cases, but that's just when you're hearing medium and heavy duty in this presentation, we're thinking mostly of freight movements.
Thanks, Paula. That's an important clarification. And I think, again, this relates to, the fact that we are in very early stages here and still trying to refine exactly, what the scope of the framework will be when it is first implemented versus how it can expand in the future. And that's also just an important piece to provide comments on. All right, so I will move to this section now, in which I'll provide an overview of ongoing work, which includes an implementation assessment, and then Krista will provide an overview of the development of T inputs and assumptions for that assessment. So we'll begin with the implementation assessment that ED staff are working on conducting jointly with our interagency partners and the IOUs. Staff plans to share in the future a work product that covers the methodology, the specific INA, and the results. I just wanted to note that up top because, again, this is just a high level of where we are right now, but there will be a much more detailed work product in the future once this work is completed. The objectives of the implementation assessment are to establish an initial set of inputs that can be used for a case study, but also can inform the development of the more comprehensive common inputs and assumptions for formal planning and forecasting in the future, or the reform that Paul covered. Another objective is to obtain indicative results to understand the potential magnitude of infrastructure needs. Also, to identify at a high level the medium and heavy duty regulatory market and infrastructure barriers and potential solutions. And finally, to use the lessons learned from the implementation assessment to refine the scope of the FIP framework. In other words, figure out how things can be scaled, what works and what breaks if we were to scale. The assessment will analyze specific case studies that focus on a unique set of issues associated with freight electrification. And I want to highlight that the implementation assessment is an indicative analysis, and the results produced will not be investment grade results, meaning that they should not be used for infrastructure authorizations. As I mentioned earlier, the purpose is to inform the scope, the timing, and the deliverables of the proposed FIP framework. Really use the lessons learned from this process for that. Next slide. So here we have a diagram depicting the steps of the implementation assessment, similar to those that Paul walked through for the broader FIP framework. So I'll walk through this at a high level. There are 5 key steps that the CPUC, IOUs, and other agencies are collaborating on for this, for the case studies. First, we identified small segments of corridors that we wanted to study, and where along those corridors charging stations may be necessary. We then established the inputs and assumptions for the studies, and now we're moving to the assessments that aim to answer some of the questions that Paul laid out earlier. These steps, these include, what is the amount of additional freight infrastructure or grid infrastructure needed for freight? How much time will it take to build this infrastructure? What is the cost of, transitioning to zero emission freight? And what are some of the market, regulatory, and operational issues that arise? So to go through this in a little more detail, the first step was defining the case studies. So this included identification of segments of corridors within each IOU service area for the assessment. And on the next slide, I'll cover this in a little bit more detail, but this includes, maybe a 5-mile segment or a 50-mile segment. And again, these case studies are designed to be a proof of concept. And then determining the focus of each case study, or in other words, what are the unique regulatory, market, operational issues that the case studies could shed light on. And in some cases, we also identified sensitivities that may be included. The next 2 steps were conducted in parallel. This included identification of charging locations and also establishing the inputs and assumptions for the assessment. So Krista will cover the inputs and assumptions development next, but in summary, CTC SB 671 results were relied on as a primary input into 2 of the case studies. And the CTC results were used to determine the total number of charging stations required along 6 priority corridors. And this information was then scaled down to the specific segments to determine the total number of charging stations needed in those locations for specific planning years, for example, 2035, because again, we're looking out into the long term here. And then the specific potential locations were then identified for the stations using information such as truck routes and existing facilities such as truck stops. Currently, the IOUs are working on step 3, which includes assessing the grid needs and potentially ranking electrical infrastructure alternatives based on cost and timing of getting them online. And then next, under step 4, the CPUC will work with the IOUs and agencies to assess the market, regulatory, and operational implications based on the grid assessment results. And this will serve as a good opportunity to refine the process reforms. You could see, those process reforms is where we really engage some of those process alignment questions and issues that we raised earlier, and that's captured in the orange box at the bottom. And then finally, under step 5, we will jointly work to summarize the results and make conclusions. We'll also propose modifications to the FIP purpose, scope, and inputs and methodology, with the purpose of ensuring that FIP can be scaled up to address both fleet and electric sector needs. And again, we'll work to refine those reforms. All right, next slide. So as I noted, each IOU is conducting a case study, and each case study is focusing on a small corridor segment and on slightly different issues. So PG&E is studying a 50-mile segment in the southern portion of the service territory where I-5 and Route 99 intersect. So they're looking at this specific area because it is a rural area with existing capacity constraints. And there is freight electrification isn't anticipated in this area, yet there's a high volume of interconnection requests and known EV charging growth. And this case study will be looking at how capacity and grid infrastructure needs change over time, and we'll be looking at 2030, 2035, and 2040. Southern California Edison is studying a 19-mile segment of I-710 corridor. And this is the main route used by trucks to transport marine cargo containers to and from the ports of LA and Long Beach, which is the largest seaport complex in the Western Hemisphere, I believe, as Howard noted in some of his comments. So, this is an important area. And this case study will be focusing on 2035. A sensitivity will assess the difference in infrastructure needs, assuming unmanaged charging versus managed charging. And then finally, we have SDG&E, which is studying a 5-mile radius capturing 805 and I-5. And this is an important area to study because this is a freight crossing to the California-Mexico border. This is at the Otay-Mesa border crossing area. So that's a quick overview of the case studies. Again, proof of concept, which we hope to use to refine the process and really use the lessons learned to continue to coordinate with various agencies before we put out a final proposal later this year. All right, so with that, I will pass it over to Krista.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Krista Heavey, and I'm an associate director at E3. And E3 is supporting the CPUC on the development of the inputs and assumptions for this initial FIP implementation assessment. So I'll be going over the process that we're doing for this initial work, as well as the longer term goals for broader input and assumption gathering. Next slide. So the overall goal of the inputs and assumptions process is to get the agencies and stakeholders to coordinate on what future we're planning for with regards to transportation electrification. So there's a lot of different inputs that could be used for the different analyses that the state agencies are working on, and we want to try to align on a common set of inputs and assumptions for use in those planning proceedings. So longer term, as we continue to work on this FIP framework and develop it into a more formal process, the future inputs and assumptions work will try to establish that process for developing common, medium, and heavy-duty inputs for use in state plannings. So these may include transportation electrification planning, the high DER proceeding, the IRP, the IPER, and GRC. In the near term, and what we're focusing mostly on today, is the inputs and assumptions gathering for these initial FIP case studies that Carolina just described. So with this initial proof of concept, we are looking to document the key inputs and assumptions that the IOUs will be using in their case studies, validate those key inputs and note any differences between them or any deviation from other statewide inputs, and then inform that future FIP process for broader inputs and assumptions gathering by flagging any items that need additional coordination or consideration going forward. Next slide, please. So we've provided an overview graphic here of the FIP case study and specifically the inputs and assumptions process. So the blue boxes here are the key inputs that we're looking at. Key outputs are highlighted in the gold boxes, and then key processes within this case study are in the green boxes. So starting on the left side here, there's a number of key inputs that we're documenting as the initial parts of the case study. So we first have vehicle inputs, and some key vehicle inputs that we are documenting are vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, and the efficiency of the vehicles. We also have the different assumptions regarding vehicle adoption. So what the statewide adoption trajectory looks like for ZEVs in general, and then how is that split up between battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles, and also what are the travel behaviors and overall statewide traffic on key priority corridors. And then we also have charger inputs. So these include station costs, the charger power output, number of chargers per site, and the average utilization. So those different inputs are being gathered by the IOUs, the CTC, the CEC, and relying on some key ARB studies. And those go into the calculation for the overall charging station need. So we are leveraging some of the work that's already been done by CTC, which we'll discuss on a later slide, as part of the SB 671 process to estimate the number of chargers needed statewide and the associated energy demand. From there, we move into the actual case study part of the process where the IOUs conduct their own analysis. So each IOU scales the charger need to their specific case study area. So the different corridors that Carolina highlighted on an earlier slide. And then the CEC has provided load shapes for different medium and heavy duty vehicle classes, which are then used to estimate the load that will be needed in each case study area. We have one more key input box here on the right side, which are each IOU's distribution inputs. So we'll be looking to the IOUs to provide the unit costs for different upgrades and the associated timing, so that the overall case study results, as shown in this last box in orange, will produce items such as potential overloads, required upgrades, and associated costs and timing with those. And so this is the overall process for inputs and assumptions on just these case studies as part of the initial FIP implementation assessment. Later on, when we look to develop a more formal process for the FIP, there will be similar inputs and assumptions processes to develop for the broader FIP. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, one of the key inputs to the FIP case studies is the work that's been done by CTC. So as response to SB 671, CTC has been working on identifying freight corridors and the infrastructure needed to support the deployment of ZEVs. So their work identified 6 priority corridors, and we used those to help inform which case studies were picked for each IOU. Their model also projected the number of charging stations that it would be required to meet the state's goals. So we used the CTC's model. We were trying to leverage as much of the great work that they've already done and avoid duplicate work. So we took the projected statewide number of charging stations and mapped that to the specific case study areas that each IOU chose to identify the stations needed in those areas. And then that's what feeds into the overall case study to look at potential grid upgrades that would be required to serve that new charging load. So another key part of our inputs and assumptions process has been comparing the inputs used by CTC through their SB 671 work and also what CEC has used in the IPER. So we are working on identifying any differences between those two different processes and using them to benchmark each other as we look to flesh out this list of common inputs. Next slide, please. So we wanted to highlight just a couple differences between what we've seen in the inputs used by CTC in the SB 671 model and what CEC assumes in the IPER. And this is just to note that there's different inputs, different sources out there. And so this is just to highlight the need for coordination going forward. So one key input that influences the overall charging need is the ZEV population forecast. So how many ZEVs do we see in the medium and heavy duty sector in future years? And so CTC in their SB 671 work, they based their forecast on the Advanced Clean Trucks and Advanced Clean Fleets regulations and what CARB has estimated that overall forecast to be. Similarly, CEC in the IPER developed the Additional Achievable Transportation Electrification 3 scenario, which also seeks to align with the CARB regulations. Vehicle efficiency is another key input. CTC is leveraging some inputs that were published by UC Davis in a recent study. And CEC has calibrated their vehicle efficiency inputs to align with CARB's MFAC model. And then another key input, which I'll highlight a bit more in detail on the next slide, is the annual vehicle miles traveled for different vehicle classes. So CTC is leveraging a CARB summary of different VMT inputs, and CEC uses the MFAC model for their IPER. So this is just to note that there's a lot of different numbers out there, and in a lot of cases, we may even be using the same source or the same assumptions, but just due to different interpretations with different vehicle classes and how they're treated, sometimes it can result in differences. So let's go to the next slide, please. So as an example of this, we wanted to highlight just that the wide range of potential inputs out there. So taking vehicle miles traveled as an example, a recent UC Davis study shows the really wide range of potential values for this particular input. And the same is true for vehicle efficiency, looking at kilowatt hours per mile. But the example here is shown for VMT. And so we wanted to use this as an example to really highlight the importance of selecting common inputs and assumptions and really show that there's a lot of different values out there that could be considered. And it's very tricky to try to align on the exact inputs we want to use. But this really shows the importance of trying to coordinate across the state agencies and across different proceedings so that we're all planning towards the same future. Next slide, please. So as we showed on the previous slide, the different statewide planning processes must consider the risks and consequences of using or of having inconsistent inputs and assumptions. And so in this initial FIP case study inputs and assumptions gathering, we're hoping to set the stage for future inputs and assumptions development going forward. And so through that work, we are hoping that interagency staff will work to establish a scope of work, a schedule, and a stakeholder process, identify any inputs and assumptions, inconsistencies, and gaps, determine which of those to address, and also noting that in some cases, we may want to use different inputs and assumptions, so just identifying if and when that occurs. And then finally, ultimately developing a common set of TE inputs and assumptions. And then overall, this process to align inputs and assumptions statewide, we hope that that will improve regulatory efficiency, stakeholder vetting, interagency coordination, transparency, efficient use of ratepayer funds, and ultimately achieving California's statewide policy goals and CARB's targets. Next slide. All right, so I will pass it back to Carolina.
Thanks so much, Krista. All right, we are a little bit ahead of schedule, but why don't we all take a 5-minute break here? That will give the panelists an opportunity to do another scan through the Q&A list and see if there is anything we haven't addressed. I think there are a few questions. We'll respond to those either in written form or orally after we return from the break at 3:53, and then we'll cover stakeholder engagement. All right, see you all then. All right, so it is 3:53, so we will get started. We've done a scan of the questions, and I believe we have responded to a majority already. If we have not responded to your question yet in the chat, we will do so. One question that we did see is by Jesse Lund. Is the proposal here that fleets would move their existing depots to these newly identified optimized zones? Excellent question. Audrey, yeah, can you move to slide 29, I believe? So these optimized zones, this is, again, an early concept, one that we still need to do a lot of work on to develop further, but some initial ideas, as we included here, are that these could be, for example, what we call ready to electrify zones, or zones that don't require any major infrastructure investments. And, we would be basically highlighting them for those that are ready to get the charging stations online as soon as possible, that those are ideal zones for that. They can also include, for example, the optimal zones that best meet both the business needs and the electric sector requirements and policy goals. And I think this is a very important one. And this is something that Paul spoke to earlier. Business needs are a major consideration in this work. I don't think it is really feasible for businesses to, move their businesses to different locations. And that may not even fit the definition of optimal, right? We understand that businesses operate the way that they do because over time they have, refined their business models and have established the most efficient routes and have chosen the locations for their depots for certain reasons. And so I believe a lot of this work will be starting with what are the existing facilities that we are looking at, and how can we really take those into consideration when looking at a lot of these other requirements that we are also trying to meet. And we know that that we probably won't be able to meet each factor kind of at 100%, and that we have to find the solution that best fits all of these different constraints. So I think the short answer to the question is no, but this is an area that we certainly would love to hear suggestions from stakeholders on.
Carly, I'd just also like to add that, when we were talking on slide 33, when we're going through the main FIP proposal, I think it's boxes 3 and 4, what we're highlighting there is, with consultation between the utilities and their understanding of the electrical system and the freight industry and their business needs, we would iterate between steps 3 and 4 to find out where there's a least regret solution. So that's the core of the proposal. The other aspect of this is, if you go all the way down to step 7 in the bottom right-hand corner, is if we're going to do all this planning and we're going to send an investment signal to the market, which would be the freight industry, this one segment, and say, we found these places of the grid, parts of the grid where, from a cost and timing perspective, it's great to interconnect, not so great, horrible to interconnect. So we just need to find a way, using sort of this grid readiness assessment, to send an investment signal to the market, maybe through charging behind the meter, charging funding, infrastructure funding is a way to send an investment signal to the market. But at the end of the day, if the market doesn't want to go there for a particular reason, we should have caught that in between steps 3 and 4. If we come up with an optimal solution and half the market says this is a failure, then this process doesn't work. So this is why it's really important that we have a good stakeholder process that captures freight needs, and it's in the near future port needs, as an example, to identify what is optimal, and then also allow you to understand what is optimal from an electric sector perspective, And if there's a gap and we can't resolve it in this process, then part of the proposal here is elevating it to the principals at the transportation level and at the electric sector level. And, you know, someone makes a call. So that's the vision behind this proposal.
Thanks, Paul. Those are really important elements to highlight. And I think with that, we can probably move to the stakeholder engagement section, in which Emily will walk through the opportunities that are coming up for stakeholders to participate in the process, and the instructions for comments, and the many questions that we are seeking everyone's input on.
Thanks so much, Carolina. So like Carolina said, I'll be providing an overview of some of our upcoming opportunities for stakeholder engagement. Next slide, please. So this table shows some opportunities that we expect over the upcoming months. So today we're holding our FIP framework informal webinar. And in June of 2023, we asked that informal stakeholder comments be submitted. We'll provide more details on that in a moment. In Q3 of this year, we expect to release some of the preliminary FIP implementation assessment results and hold an additional webinar as well. There may be additional engagements on these results that we hold before the end of the year. In Q4 of this year, we plan to release the staff proposal on the implementation of the framework, and that will provide an opportunity for parties to file formal comments. In 2024, we expect to begin implementing the recommendations for the FIP framework. Next slide, please. So next, I'll be walking through the instructions for filing stakeholder comments. We ask that you please submit comments within 30 days, so that's by 6/21/23. And we ask that comments be submitted via email to all 3 emails listed on that slide. That includes Paula Grunling, Paul Douglas, and myself, Emily Clayton. We ask that when you're preparing comments, you please note the question number in each response. And if your comments reference a specific slide from the webinar, please include the slide number where applicable. This will help to facilitate our review. We do not have any page limit for the responses. We also ask that your comments include citations to any reports or studies that you reference, and that you only cite to sources that are publicly available. With respect to how we'll be using the comments, we plan to post these comments on the FIP webpage, which is linked on this slide. We would like to note that the comments from stakeholders we are soliciting on this proposal are not part of any active proceeding. However, feedback we received during and following the webinar may inform future staff work products. For example, future work products that may be introduced to the formal record through a CPUC ruling. And at that time, we would take formal comments. If you have any questions about this process, please feel free to reach out to Paula Grunling or Paul Douglas. Next slide, please. So next, I'll move on to review the questions we're posing to stakeholders. If you have any questions about the content of these questions you'd like us to address, please enter them into the Q&A section at this time. While we don't have time to review each of the questions for this webinar in depth, I'll briefly be highlighting some key themes. So our first set of questions 1 through 6 solicit feedback on the FIP proposal itself. So these include the purpose and objectives for FIP, the FIP problem statement, other vehicle classes that should potentially be in scope, any recommended changes to the process inputs or outputs, the timing horizon, and whether the potential scale and timing of electrification on priority freight corridors requires modifications to the FIP proposal. Next slide, please. Our next set of questions, 7 through 12, address a broader set of concerns related to FIP implementation. These include whether FIP should be identifying optimal charging zones or specific charging sites, coordination issues across load-serving entities, electrification across international borders, whether a sequence of electrification should be established, land acquisition needs, and reliability and resiliency definitions. Next slide, please. Questions 13 through 19 look at planning and interagency coordination. These include how FIP should be capturing interactive effects and potential trade-offs between TE, building electrification, decarbonization, grid hardening, and affordability. The role for climate adaptation strategies, process alignments for interagency and IOU forecasting and planning, and whether the IPER should be considering FIP inputs related to infrastructure delays or other uncertainties. Next slide, please. Questions 20 through 23 address specific elements of the interagency planning process. These include whether IPER's load bus allocation is appropriate for distribution planning, interactions between the IOU's bottom-up determinations of MDHD load and the CEC's top-down statewide forecast and load bus allocation, suggested planning improvements for co-optimizing distribution and transmission upgrades triggered by MDHD freight electrification. Next slide, please. Our final set of questions, 24 and 25, pose additional questions on interagency planning. These include whether CAISO's transmission assessments capture localized load impacts from TE, and the role of federal and state charging infrastructure funds in distribution and transmission upgrades. Lastly, question 26 provides stakeholders with the opportunity to share any additional comments. As with any other comments you submit, we ask that you include the number of any slides that are referenced. Next slide, please. And I'll pass things back over to Carolina.
Thank you, Emily. Actually, I will be passing it over to Paula to close out the webinar.
Okay, so let me just move this over here so I'm not looking sideways. Okay, so it was a lot of information. We did have a lot of questions. We did introduce potentially a lot of new concepts to the audience. So I just want to say that this is a working proposal. We spent a lot of time trying to, sort of wrap our head around how we could, propose a framework that would be taking into account certain issues related to transportation electrification and how to sort of bring together both transportation needs and grid planning. Because grid planning, do not have to take that into account. And now with transportation electrification, we do need to consider that. So this is our first attempt. As you see, we have a lot of questions. You did have a lot of questions. We tried to address them as best as we could, but we are seeking your feedback so we can improve this framework and in due course expand it. So you saw the, what we took into account, the issues that we dealt with. And one of the things that I would ask is when you're considering proposing new use cases to expand to different vehicle classes and use cases, like, we had several questions from the port, take into account the topics that we had to consider here, and how would you suggest we would go about that if we were to start considering, the suggested area. We are not committing to a certain date to engage this audience again on the FIP, but we believe that this will be an ongoing conversation between now and the end of the year. So we welcome the opportunity to talk, and we are really looking forward to your comments and to continue this process. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to Paul, Emily, and me via our emails. And we really appreciate your time and looking forward to continuing the conversation. With that, I'll close the webinar. Thanks very much, everyone. And we'll post the questions and answers as well, and we'll answer any of the questions that we might have missed. There were quite a few in writing, and we'll put all the documentation on the website. Thanks, everyone, and have a good week.